Chapter 80 of Barnaby Rudge. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Barnaby Rudge by Charles Dickens. Chapter 80. That afternoon, when he had slept off his fatigue, had shaved and washed and dressed and freshened himself from top to toe, when he had dined, comforted himself with a pipe, an extra Toby, a nap in the great armchair, and a quiet chat with Mrs. Varden on everything that had happened, was happening, or about to happen, within the sphere of their domestic concern, the locksmith sat himself down at the tea-table in the little back parlour, the rosiest, cosiest, merriest, heartiest, best contented old buck in Great Britain or out of it. There he sat, with his beaming eye on Mrs. V., and his shining face suffused with gladness, and his capacious waistcoat smiling in every wrinkle, and his jovial humour peeping from under the table in the very plumpness of his legs, a sight to turn the vinegar of misanthropy into purest milk of human kindness. There he sat, watching his wife as she decorated the room with flowers for the greater honour of Dolly and Joseph Willet, who had gone out walking, and for whom the tea-kettle had been singing gaily on the hob full 20 minutes, chirping as never kettle chirped before, for whom the best service of real undoubted china, patterned with divers round-faced mandarins holding up broad umbrellas, was now displayed in all its glory, to tempt whose appetites a clear, transparent, juicy ham, garnished with cool green lettuce leaves and fragrant cucumber, reposed upon a shady table, covered with a snow-white cloth, for whose delight preserves and jams, crisped cakes and other pastry, short to eat, with cunning twists, and cottage loaves, and rolls of bread, both white and brown, were all set forth in rich profusion; in whose youth Mrs. V. herself had grown quite young, and stood there in a gown of red and white, symmetrical in figure, buxom in bodice, ruddy in cheek and lip, faultless in ankle, laughing in face and mood, in all respects delicious to behold. There sat the locksmith among all and every these delights, the sun that shone upon them all, the centre of the system, the source of light, heat, life, and frank enjoyment in the bright household world. And when had Dolly ever been the Dolly of that afternoon? To see how she came in arm with Joe, and how she made an effort not to blush or seem at all confused, and how she made believe she didn't care to sit on his side of the table, and how she coaxed the locksmith in a whisper not to joke, and how her colour came and went in a little restless flutter of happiness, which made her do everything wrong, and yet so charmingly wrong that it was better than right. Why, the locksmith could have looked on at this, as he mentioned to Mrs. Varden when they retired for the night, for 24 hours at a stretch, and never wished it done. The recollections, too, with which they made merry over that long protracted tea, the glee with which the locksmith asked Joe if he remembered that stormy night at the Maypole when he first asked after Dolly, the laugh they all had about that night when she was going out to the party in the sedan chair, the unmerciful manner in which they rallied Mrs. Varden about putting those flowers outside that very window, the difficulty Mrs. Varden found in joining the laugh against herself, at first, and the extraordinary perception she had of the joke when she overcame it, the confidential statements of Joe concerning the precise day and hour when he was first conscious of being fond of Dolly, and Dolly's blushing admissions, half volunteered and half extorted, as to the time from which she dated the discovery that she didn't mind Joe, here was an exhaustless fund of mirth and conversation. Then there was a great deal to be said regarding Mrs. Varden's doubts and motherly alarms and shrewd suspicions, and it appeared that from Mrs. Varden's penetration and extreme sagacity nothing had ever been hidden. She had known it all along. She had seen it from the first. She had always predicted it. She had been aware of it before the principals. She had said within herself, for she remembered the exact words, "That young Willet is certainly looking after our Dolly, and I must look after him." Accordingly, she had looked after him, and had observed many little circumstances, all of which she named, so exceedingly minute that nobody else could make anything out of them even now, and had, it seemed, from first to last, displayed the most unbounded tact and most consummate generalship. Of course, the night when Joe would ride homeward by the side of the chaise, and when Mrs. Varden would insist upon his going back again, was not forgotten, nor the night when Dolly fainted on his name being mentioned, nor the times upon times when Mrs. Varden, ever watchful and prudent, had found her pining in her own chamber. In short, nothing was forgotten, and everything, by some means or other, brought them back to the conclusion that that was the happiest hour in all their lives. consequently that everything must have occurred for the best, and nothing could be suggested which would have made it better. While they were in the full glow of such discourse as this, there came a startling knock at the door, opening from the street into the workshop, which had been kept closed all day that the house might be more quiet. Joe, as in duty bound, would hear of nobody but himself going to open it, and accordingly left the room for that purpose. It would have been odd enough, certainly, if Joe had forgotten the way to this door, and even if he had, as it was a pretty large one and stood straight before him, he could not easily have missed it. But Dolly, perhaps because she was in the flutter of spirits before mentioned, or perhaps because she thought he would not be able to open it with his one arm, she could have had no other reason, hurried out after him, and they stopped so long in the passage, no doubt owing to Joe's entreaties that she would not expose herself to the draught of July air, which must infallibly come rushing in on this same door being opened, that the knock was repeated in a yet more startling manner than before. "Is anybody going to open that door?" cried the locksmith, "or shall I come?" Upon that, Dolly went running back into the parlour, all dimples and blushes, and Joe opened it with a mighty noise and other superfluous demonstrations of being in a violent hurry. "Well," said the locksmith when he reappeared, "what is it, Joe? What are you laughing at?" "Nothing, sir. It's coming in." "Who's coming in? What's coming in?" Mrs. Varden, as much at a loss as her husband, could only shake her head in answer to his inquiring look. So the locksmith wheeled his chair round to command a better view of the room door, and stared at it with his eyes wide open and a mingled expression of curiosity and wonder shining in his jolly face. Instead of some person or persons straightway appearing, divers remarkable sounds were heard, first in the workshop, and afterwards in the little dark passage between it and the parlour, as though some unwieldy chest or heavy piece of furniture were being brought in by an amount of human strength inadequate to the task. At length, after much struggling and humping and bruising of the wall on both sides, the door was forced open as by a battering ram, and the locksmith, steadily regarding what appeared beyond, smote his thigh, elevated his eyebrows, opened his mouth, and cried, in a loud voice expressive of the utmost consternation, "Damn me if it ain't Miggs come back!" The young damsel whom he named no sooner heard these words than, deserting the small boy and a very large box by which she was accompanied, and advancing with such precipitation that her bonnet flew off her head, burst into the room, clasped her hands, in which she held a pair of pattens, one in each, raised her eyes devotedly to the ceiling, and shed a flood of tears. "The old story!" cried the locksmith, looking at her in inexpressible desperation. "She was born to be a damper, this young woman. Nothing can prevent it." "Oh, master! Oh, Mim!" cried Miggs. "Can I constrain my feelings in these here once again united moments? Oh, Mr. Warson, here's blessedness among relations, sir. Here's forgivenesses of injuries. Here's amicablenesses." The locksmith looked from his wife to Dolly, and from Dolly to Joe, and from Joe to Miggs, with his eyebrows still elevated and his mouth still open. When his eyes got back to Miggs, they rested on her, fascinated. "To think," cried Miggs with hysterical joy, "that Mr. Joe and dear Miss Dolly has rarely come together after all as has been said and done contrary. To see them two a-settin' along with him and her, so pleasant, and in all respects so affable and mild, and me not knowing of it, and not being in the ways to make no preparations for their teas. Oh, what a cutting thing it is, and yet what sweet sensations is awoke within me!" Either in clasping her hands again, or in an ecstasy of pious joy, Miss Miggs clinked her pattens after the manner of a pair of cymbals at this juncture, and then resumed in the softest accents, "And did my missus think, oh goodness, did she think as her own Miggs, which supported her under so many trials, and understood her nater when them as intended well but acted rough, went so deep into her feelings? Did she think as her own Miggs would ever leave her? Did she think as Miggs, though she was but a servant, and knowed that servitudes was no inheritances, would forget that she was the humble instruments as always made it comfortable between them two when they fell out, and always told master of the meekness and forgiveness of her blessed dispositions? Did she think as Miggs had no attachments? Did she think that wages was her only object?" To none of these interrogatories, whereof every one was more pathetically delivered than the last, did Mrs. Varden answer one word. But Miggs, not at all abashed by this circumstance, turned to the small boy in attendance, her eldest nephew, son of her own married sister, born in Golden Lion Court, No. 27, and bred in the very shadow of the second bell-handle on the right-hand door-post, and with a plentiful use of her pocket-handkerchief, addressed herself to him, requesting that on his return home he would console his parents for the loss of her, his aunt, by delivering to them a faithful